Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Wonderful to see you. Thanks, Bert, as always, for making this group happen. Always a pleasure to have an opportunity to learn a little bit, to learn together. The topic that we're going to cover, hopefully over the course of the next 2 or 3 weeks, that, as I mentioned to Bert before everyone else signed on, there is an outside chance that I am hopping on a plane to Israel tomorrow or Wednesday, for an event, for a Maharat event in Israel. If that happens, I may miss Monday. I'm not going to fly on Sunday, which is a fast day. I'll probably fly on Monday. If that happens, I will let Bert know as soon as possible, and then Rabbi Bracha will fill in with maybe some 3 weeks related matters.
Great.
Um, so as soon as I know, you guys will be the first to know as well, maybe after my wife. Um, so what we're going to cover is the question of what's called sometimes Amira Lagoy or Amira Lenochri, or Amira Le'enu Yehudi. Um, and it raises the question of um, what, if anything, am I permitted to ask a non-Jew to do on my behalf over the course of Shabbat? Um, So people might be familiar with the kind of hinting idea that if it's like, I don't know, if it's dark and you want to read, you can say to somebody, I wish I could read my book in here or something like that. There are different ways that people might be familiar with this.
Yes.
And what we're going to see is that a lot of the things that are popular are sort of mistaken. Um, so we're going to sort of go down to sort of a more fundamental question, which is what are the circumstances in which is one is actually just permitted when one is permitted to do this, then one could just say, can you please do X, Y, or Z on my behalf? Because there's some need that has been developed such that it's permissible. So for example, can you please press the button because I live on the 37th floor in a building in Manhattan, whatever the case might be.
Mhm.
Um, so that's kind of step number one. That's the bigger question we're going to get to. And some of it will be fairly technical. But before we kind of dive into the technicalities, I want to take a step back and ask a broader question, which is based on an interesting linguistic difference between the way in which the 39 melachot appear in a list, the 39 prohibited categories of labor, as they appear in a list in the Mishnah and Masechet Shabbat, as opposed to the way that very same list of 39 categories appears when the Rambam codifies them. So the list in the Mishnah is just, I'm not going to read through this whole list, but on page number one, you should be able to see now the word Hazoreh. I got in my version if you're looking at the share screen. It says Hazorea, Vahachoresh, Vahakotzer, one who plants or one who plows or one who cuts, or one who winnows and all these things. And it's describing a kind of a process basically of planting a seed, and then making it into bread basically. Um, it's what's
But
called.
Jeff, you mentioned the 39 Av Malachos. Does the same rules for with regard to Amir Lanachri that you're going to be talking about apply to the offspring, the Toldos?
Yes, same rules apply to every aspect of halacha, both Deoraita and Derabanan, Av and Tolda. Um, So, as it appears in the Mishnah, it says Hazorea and Hachoresh, the one who plants a seed. As opposed to if you see the way in which the Rambam lists them, he says instead of Hazorea, he says Hazri'ah, the planting, as it were. For the Mishnah, it refers to the one who acts, as opposed to the Rambam who refers to the action being done in a more passive voice. Um, there is a position that the prohibition to ask a non-Jew to violate halacha is in and of itself a Torah prohibition. Most people are going to assume, as we'll see eventually next week or the week after, that in fact the prohibition of me asking a non-Jew to violate halacha is only rabbinic. But there is a minority position that claims that not only are all these 39 categories prohibited, but I'm also prohibited from the Torah to ask a non-Jew to violate any matter of halacha and Shabbat. What that seems like is, in the Rambam's formulation, he seems to be prohibiting not just a Jew from doing melacha, which is sort of the active voice that you see in the Mishnah, but the Rambam seems to be prohibiting melacha from being done in a more passive voice. Okay,
Does it say what the, where that comes from, or how to, what the, what the source for that is in the Torah?
well, none of this stuff appears in the written Torah. This is all the rabbis deciding the parameters of the dinim d'oraita, because
Uh,
the Torah doesn't list the 39 categories, the whole system, right? It's often this is a funny thing to say, but what's the oraita and what's the rabbanan has very little to do with what's written in the Torah. You shouldn't really say that out loud, but the Torah has nothing to do with what's the oraita. The rabbis decide that there's this category, and they figure out, is it this way or is it that way? That is to say, Chazal define the parameters of what's the oraita, what's from the Torah, and what's only, so to speak, from the rabbis. Now, if you wanted to say that in a more classical way, you would say it, Chazal had a tradition as to what was the oraita, and that tradition emerges from the time of Moshe and Har Sinai. Um, and that's the way the Rambam would say it. But you can't clearly distinguish the oraita from the Rabbanan based on psukim in the Torah or in the Navi. The rabbis decide all this stuff. So this question of, is there a prohibition for a Jew to do melacha on the one hand, the active voice of the Mishnah, or is there a prohibition for melacha to be done in a more passive voice, as it appears in the Rambam, is actually a debate that flows through all of Hilchot Shabbat. For example, if you think about unintentional doing of melacha is related to this question, and asking a non-Jew is the same type of issue. If there's a prohibition for a Jew to do melacha, then the Torah wouldn't be bothered if a non-Jew does melacha on my behalf. It's just about my behavior and only my behavior. This also ends up going into a whole Kabbalistic world of the nature of what it means for the earth to rest. And if a Jew is causing melacha to happen, maybe the earth isn't resting appropriately. So, okay, we're not going to deal so much with the Kabbalistic stuff, but know that that's part of what's going on in the background of the debate around Amira of a Jew asking a non-Jew, is this question of active versus passive, of actively doing melacha as opposed to passively causing melacha to be done. Okay, so let's keep that kind of debate in our background, in our back of our minds. And then, so we're going to now go to page number 2 and encounter a great story. Now, there's a little bit of background we need to know in order to make sense of this story, which is on the top. Oh, I didn't put page numbers in. No, the other page, on top of page number 2, source number 1 of this sort of second section. The following parameters are important in order to understand this story. Number 1, they assumed that if you're going to do a bris, you needed to have hot water to clean the baby. That it was a matter of pikuach nefesh, a life-saving health risk to the baby to not be able to clean the baby. They did not have as quite of a complex germ theory as we do today, but they knew that you needed to clean the baby when you're going to do a milah, when you do a circumcision. Number 1. Therefore, even number 2 on Shabbat, that was also the case. So that means they needed to have hot water to do a bris even on Shabbos, and that could create a challenge if the water wasn't heated in advance. Okay? And so the story that we're going to have is an instance in which the hot water had been prepared before Shabbat, and then Shabbat morning they go to do the bris, and lo and behold, the hot water has spilled. And now we have to figure out, how do we get hot water so that we can do the bris? What happens if, for example, a neighbor has some hot water available to them? Again, in their universe, picture for a moment a number of houses, of smaller homes that open onto a shared courtyard, as opposed to like sort of like an apartment building with a lobby or an apartment building with a hallway. So I was supposed, and the bris wasn't happening in shul with a huge crowd. The bris was like the family and the moel. There was no bagels and lox yet. Right, it's a small affair. Don't picture a contemporary bris; it'll just get confusing. So, but picture something more like an apartment building with a hallway or a series of houses that open onto a shared courtyard. So in house number A, they were going to do the bris, and the water has spilled inside house number A. Now the bris is going to be in trouble, and we don't want to push off a bris. Okay, so if you take a look at source number 1, I just cut and pasted the translations from Sefaria. So you have here the Steinsaltz English, so you can follow along in the English. I'll read in the original. Hahu Yanuka Ishtapech Chamime. There was a 8-day-old baby whose hot water had spilled, the water that was getting ready for the bris. Amar lahu Rabba. Rabba says to, I guess, the gathered guests, Naiti lechamime migo beitai. He says to them, you know what? I have some hot water in my house. Why don't you go bring the hot water from my house so that we can do the bris? Again, the assumption being that the hot water is absolutely necessary for the bris itself. So Abaye says, great idea, Rabbah. We have a problem, though. There's no Eruv in place. We can't carry from your house to this house. Now, important to note, we're not carrying in the public thoroughfare. This is only carrying in what's called a chatzer. So picture like the hallway of an apartment building. So it's from a bayit to a chatzer is only quote unquote a rabbinic violation of carrying because they're not going into the public thoroughfare. So says Abaye to Rabbah, it's all well and good that you have hot water in your home. Amrle Abaye v'ha lo arvina, but we don't have an eruv that allows us to carry from bayit A through the chatzer into bayit B, or from apartment 6B to apartment 6A via the hallway of the Algiers. I'm just trying to give you an image of what this is describing. So Rabbah says, bring the water. And Abaye says, no, we don't have an Eruv. Amrle, so Rabbah says back to Abaye, Nismoch Ashituf. So instead of relying on the Eruv Chatzerot instead of having an Eruv, let's rely on a Shituf Mivot. So again, since this is a suboptimal way to permit carrying, because we're only talking about quote unquote a rabbinic violation. We're not going into the public thoroughfare. We only need what's called a shituf mivoot, because this is like a mavui, which is the chatzer area or the hallway. Amarle lo shatfina, but we don't have a shituf mivoot. We don't have any way. We didn't do it before Shabbat. You actually can't carry on a rabbinic level into this chatzer. Carrying is prohibited. So Rabbah says, fine, nemru le lagoy laiti le. But if we ourselves can't carry, let's have a non-Jew carry the water from Bayit A through the Chatzer and into Bayit B, which is a rabbinic violation of carrying on Shabbat. Note, they're not saying to heat the water. They're just saying carry the water. And the carrying that's happening is only a quote-unquote rabbinic violation of carrying. That's going to be very important as we go forward, which is why I'm doing this slowly. What Rabbah is telling the Mohel or Abaye to do is violate halacha midirabanan for the sake of the mitzvah of Mila to happen on time. Yes, Bert.
Do we have an issue? I thought that, because it's potential pekuach nefesh, that in that case, the health issue overrides,
Well,
and Shabbos.
You'd have to push the bris off.
I see. In other words, you can't say, well, we have to do the bris, and that therefore, since we needed to, for pekuach nefesh to clean it, so it's the pekuach. I'm confused a little bit, so much.
The pekuach nefesh here is that you can't do a bris without hot water, but you can always push a bris off, right?
I see.
This is not about health. The health concern is that the bris can't happen without the hot water. So we're violating a din derabanan, carrying in this particular way, for the sake of doing the mitzvah on time, because we can't do the milah without the hot water. So they say to him, okay, have the non-Jew carry the water. It's only rabbinic carrying. We'll do the bris on time. Amar Abaye. Abaye says, Abaye la'otve lamar. I have a question that I want to ask to Rabbah. Abaye seems to be uncomfortable with Rabbah's psak. So Abaye says, wait a minute, Rebbe, don't do it. V'lo shavchen Rabbi Yosef. And Rabbi Yosef says to Abaye, no, don't ask any questions. No questions allowed. Let's go ahead with the bris. Dam Rabbi Yosef amar Rav Kahana, ki havinu me Rav Yehuda amar lan. Because here's the following rule. This is a good rule of thumb in general. B'deoraita, when you have a shaila on a level of a din deoraita, it's a Torah question. Motavinan tiyufta. Bahadar of Dinan Masi. Ask all your questions, and then we'll go and act. But the Rabbanan, of Dinan Maaseh, just do the thing, because it's just talking about rabbinic carrying. V'hadar mutvino tiyuvta. Then we'll ask all the questions. Meaning, it's very good that you, Rabbi Yosef, you, Abaye, have a whole bunch of questions for Rabbah, but you're only concerned about a rabbinic thing, and we want to do the Mila on time, because Mila on time is super important. So therefore, let's just carry the water, do the bris, and leave us alone. Stop being such a nudnik. Let the goy carry the water, which is only a rabbinic violation of carrying. And then after Shabbos or on Sunday, you can ask all your questions. Okay? That's the case. That's the situation. If we were to put this in more abstract terms, what the Gemara is saying is that for the sake of the fulfillment of a mitzvah, i.e., Mila in its appropriate time, one can ask a non-Jew to violate Shabbat on a rabbinic level. Okay, that's the sort of abstract principle that one could pull out of this case. Okay, that's how I want to kind of read it in its most limited fashion. Now the Gemara is curious. It sounds like there's almost a presumed ellipsis here, and then the bris goes ahead, and then we come back to the scene of Rabbah and Rabbi Yosef. What was your question? Okay, go to page number 3. Page number 3, where you'll now see a couple of colors on the page, and you see number lines. The number lines are going to be important because, as we're going to see, there's going to be a manuscript problem here. So I want to be able to talk about lines with the lines of the Gemara with particular numbers. So now, line number 1 on the top of page number 3. Labatar hachi, afterwards, presumably now the bris is done. Hachi amar le, this is what Rabbi Yosef says to Abaye. My baye laod filamar. What was your question? Now the bris is done. What's your question? Line number 2, amar le, the Tanya, Abaye says to Rabbi Yosef, here's my question. Haza'ah shvut. Okay, these are two very strange terms. Shvut is a term that refers to a rabbinic violation of Shabbat, as opposed to a Torah violation of Shabbat. So shvut in this context means an isur d'Rabbanan on Shabbat. Was there a question, Judy?
Oh, no, I'm trying to understand it.
Okay, so shvut means a rabbinic violation of Shabbat. That becomes important because there's a general rule of thumb that there are no shvutin, there are no rabbinic laws like these don't apply in the Beit HaMikdash, which is interesting to think about. Like, why wouldn't they apply in the Mikdash? But for another time. But that's usually where it comes up, because there's a general rule that the rabbis say, Ein shvut b'mikdash. There are no rabbinic violations or no rabbinic rules or limitations in the Mikdash. So haza'ah is another principle or rule. Haza'ah literally means sprinkling. So last week's parsha, the para aduma, when a person becomes tamei meit, there's this strange ceremony that we do called the sprinkling of the ashes of the red heifer, the Efer Para Aduma. Came across a great Mishnah that said there have only been 9 Para Adumas in all of history from the time of Moshe Rabbeinu until Chorban Bayit Sheni. Now, I don't know how they know that. And every so often there's some kooks in Israel who claim to have discovered another Para Aduma. Hard to come by these days. But part of what happened was you'd burn up the ashes, you burn up this red heifer, mix it with some water, take some hyssop, dip the hyssop in the water with the ashes of the para aduma, and sprinkle it on day 3 and on day 7 of a person who's going through the process of becoming tahor from having been tamei meit. So that sprinkling is called haza'ah. And sprinkling is itself a rabbinic violation. It's an isur d'Rabbanan to sprinkle to somebody on Shabbat. So in the time of the Mikdash, one might wonder, can you sprinkle if somebody became tamei meit and their time for sprinkling comes on a Shabbos? So since it's in the Beit HaMikdash, in the time of the Mikdash, you could actually sprinkle. Bismanenu, if we found a para aduma and burned it and did all the things, one would not be permitted to do the sprinkling on the 3rd and the 7th day if the 3rd or 7th day fell out on Shabbat. Okay, but be that as it may, none of that is particularly practical. Haza'ah shvut, says the Gemara, and Amira legoy shvut. The act of saying to a non-Jew, carry the water from Bayit A through the Chatzer into Bayit B, is itself a rabbinic violation. Or the act of saying to a non-Jew, please press
No, I can't on a Zoom class, so,
Or the act of saying, turn on the oven or turn on the air conditioner. Simply me saying it is itself an Isur D'Rabbanan, says the Gemara. Haza'ah shvut ve'amira shvut. Ma haza'ah shvut ve'ina dochat haShabbat. Just like post Chorban Habayit, if your sprinkling days fall out on Shabbat, they don't dochesh Shabbat. You can't do the sprinkling on Shabbos outside of the Mikdash. Af amira legoy shvut. So too, there's an isur to tell a non-Jew to violate Shabbat. Ve'ina docha. It doesn't push off. So what Rav Yosef wanted, or what Abaye wanted to ask Rabbah was, why are you telling the non-Jew to bring the water? That's just usher. You're not allowed to tell non-Jews to violate Shabbat. Okay, that's the question at hand. Answer line 4. Amar le, Rav Yosef says back to Abai, v'lo shane lach ben shvut to eat be ma'aseh, l'shvut to late be ma'aseh. Sorry, let me just scroll down so you can see the whole English. But don't you distinguish between a rabbinic prohibition that is active as opposed to a rabbinic prohibition that is passive? So here, presumably, active and passive are referring to sprinkling on the one hand, which is an active violation. You're sprinkling the water, as opposed to a passive violation. I'm asking somebody to do something. I'm not actively carrying the water. I'm saying something, and then somebody else, the non-Jew, is carrying. So that's v'lo shayna ben shvut to eat be ma'aseh, an active rabbinic violation, sprinkling, and a shvut to late be ma'aseh, just asking, so to speak. Why? Now, line 5, Daha lo amar lagoy zil achim. He didn't say to the non-Jew, go and heat up the water. So now I'm going to re-understand line 4 based on the presence of line 5. Or to say it slightly differently, I'm going to re-understand what it be ma'aseh, active, and late be ma'aseh, passive, might actually mean, based on the assumption that line 5 is present in the text. Because line 5 seems to distinguish not between active and passive, as I said originally, speaking as opposed to sprinkling, but rather, zil achim means all I told the non-Jew to do was carry from point A to point B, which is only a rabbinic violation. And I never told the non-Jew to go heat up the water, which would be a Torah violation. So what line 5 seems to mean is that the difference between the two different types of rabbinic violations here is the following. Now I'm going to add in another layer of complexity. When it comes to Amira la'akum, when we're talking about asking a non-Jew to violate Shabbat for us, we have to keep separate two different questions. One is the prohibition to ask a non-Jew to do anything on Shabbat that violates Shabbat. The second question is the thing that non-Jew is doing. Is that non-Jew violating a din d'Rabbanan, like carrying in a particular way? Or is that non-Jew violating a din d'Oraita, a Torah law, like heating up water? Or to put it in a modern idiom, are we asking the non-Jew to push a button in an elevator, which is just, so to speak, electricity? It's only a rabbinic prohibition. Or are we asking the non-Jew to turn on an oven? Turning on an oven is a Torah prohibition. Pressing a button in an elevator is a rabbinic prohibition. Or, say it in a slightly different way, air conditioning, which these days when it's very sweaty outside, is only, turning on air conditioning is only a prohibition of electricity. It's just straight up rabbinic violation. That's much less of an issue than an oven, or if you had an incandescent bulb. Turning on an incandescent bulb could be a Torah prohibition. So part of what makes the questions around Amira, asking non-Jews to violate halacha, interesting, is that a lot will hinge on what is the nature of the violation that non-Jew is doing. Is it rabbinic or is it Torah? And what we're going to see is that if the tzorech, if the need is very high, let's say we're talking about an actual sickness, not like sickness that somebody's going to die, and you go to the hospital, but a person has a fever or a person needs antibiotics, the higher the level of need, the greater the possibility is to allow us to ask a non-Jew to violate potentially even a Torah prohibition on behalf of another person. So with line 5 in the mix here, which is the printed edition of the Talmud Bavli, the way one has to understand line 4 is that the reason Rabbah permitted the carrying of the water from point A to point B was that it was only, so to speak, a rabbinic violation. But he could have never, it appears, under almost any circumstances, have asked the non-Jew to violate a din deoraita, a Torah prohibition. Zilachim, go heat up the water. That's the way this Gemara gets understood by most people. That this Gemara is distinguishing between, is the non-Jew violating a rabbinic thing or a Torah thing? And if he's non-Jewing, if I'm only asking him to carry in an unusual manner, then in the case in which I need him to fulfill a mitzvah, I can have him carry the water from point A to point B so that I can do the Mila on time. So let me translate that into our contemporary realities. Let's say it happens to be super sweaty outside. The humidity is really high. So let's say if the air conditioning weren't on in shul, people really couldn't daven. It's not unreasonable. So am I allowed to ask the building service, the maintenance guys, to turn on the air conditioning so that we can daven comfortably in shul on Shabbat? Let me flip the question the other direction. Let's say it's wintertime. And let's say for a moment that we have a gas heater in which when you turn on the heat, you're actually turning on a fire someplace down the line. So now turning on the heat isn't just electricity, but there's actual fire being ignited. And let's say it's really cold in shul and people can't come to daven. So can you violate either the heater or the air conditioner for the sake of us davening in a minyan? If it's just air conditioning, that's only a rabbinic violation. If we're talking about the heater, it might, at least in many circumstances, actually be a Torah prohibition. So every question in the context of Amira, of asking a non-Jew, requires you to know all of Hilchot Shabbat. Because you have to be able to figure out, is this thing Doraita or Dorabanan? From the rabbis or from the Torah? Which is why this is one of the, when we, this coming year in Yeshivat Maharad, we'll be learning Hilchot Shabbat. And this is always one of the first things that we learn every year. Because then I explain to them, in order to answer every one of these shilas, you have to go now learn all of Hilchot Shabbat. It's like the intro. But now, that's one way to read this whole sugya, and that's if you assume that what is here in the blue text, line number 5, is in fact part of the text. Does that make sense to everybody? Let's stop here, ask questions. Let's make this clear. Make sense to everybody? So far, so good?
I think so.
Okay.
I have a question for you, Rabbi Fox.
Yeah.
Who is a non-Jew?
Is that a trick question?
Yep.
What do you mean by that?
Well, you're making the assumption that a non-Jew is someone who, I suppose, is Islam, believes in Allah, right?
Did you make that assumption? I didn't.
No, okay. This is the key for me, right? What if a Jew accepts the Torah but not the oral law? Is that Jew a non-Jew?
No, that was an easy one. Give me a better one.
That Jew is.
A person is fully Jewish.
But what about a Karaite?
Fully Jewish.
Karaite is fully Jewish?
Fully Jewish. Not even a question.
And
depending on their mother, but yes.
Ethiopian Kesach?
Fully Jewish. By the way, this has nothing to do with Hilchot Shabbat. These are fun questions, but nothing to do with this question.
But it has everything to do with this question because you're making the assumption, okay, so what about a Jewish animist?
Fully Jewish.
Everybody's fully Jewish.
If their mother is Jewish, they're Jewish. If they happen, they could be Jews who sin. Lots of Jews sin. That's okay.
Even if the mother is a Caraite or a Samaritan?
Yeah, I mean, it depends if they know their maternal lines, then they're Jewish, right? This case is a case where we know for certain we have to imagine the circumstances. We know the status of the people in our community. We know that Brian Cordoba, who works in the building at HIR, is not Jewish. He is not. His status is not. I thought you were going to ask questions about complicated conversions or patrilineal Jews or someone who thinks they're Jewish, but I don't think they're Jewish. Right?
Well, my understanding is that, let's say the chief rabbi of Israel, for him, an Ethiopian Kesach is not Jewish.
Oh, I didn't. I thought you just meant Ethiopian Jews. I didn't hear what's.
Well, I'm talking about Ethiopian priests. I'm talking about Samaritan priests.
Right.
But all I'm saying is, what you're saying is goes against the chief rabbi of Israel.
No. Let me try again. This whole story has to do with people we know that they're non-Jews. You're asking a secondary question, which is not related to the topic of today's class, and I'm not going to get drawn into it.
Well, but it is related because you're making the assumption that a rabbi can make a distinction, can determine what is Torah level and what is rabbinic level. All right? I think you said that.
Yes, for sure.
Okay, what gives the rabbi the authority to do that?
Okay, again, that's too far afield. That's the job of every rabbi. You have to know halacha, to know what's Torah prohibition and what's a rabbinic prohibition.
Okay, but what about the Talmud story of the oven of Aknai, which is clearly a demonstration that rabbis that do not accept what we call manifestations of God's signs and wonders in the world ought to be killed. Right?
I think you're actually misunderstanding that story, but I'm going to put a bracket.
I'm misunderstanding that story.
Yes, but
Rabbi Gamliel gets killed at the end, right?
Right, but I'm going to put a bracket around that because I want to actually make sense out of the Amira question. Right? Let's assume for our purposes that we know that the people who are working in the facilities at the HIR are not Jewish. The question of status, while I think a very seductive topic.
Okay, okay. I have a final question for you.
Yeah.
What if the person who works for the synagogue is a Messianic Jew, a Hebrew Christian who accepts Jesus as his or her savior?
You're asking interesting questions, but that's not at stake here. But what I'll say is that
it is at stake here because you're looking at this through the lens of a rabbi, and I have no problem with that whatsoever. I'm looking at this through the lens of a scholar.
No, you're not.
Different lens.
No.
My lens is not right?
No.
I don't have the right to look at this from another lens?
It's a different set of questions, right? My understanding of this is a halacha chabura. You want to know halacha. I have a non-Jew who works in my building who is a very friendly non-Jew. You're asking a question about status questions are super interesting. And I think are very seductive, potentially, for sure, in the 21st century. What I'll say about, Jews for Jesus is, if their mother is Jewish, then they're Jewish. It happens to be that most Jews for Jesus these days are no longer halachically Jewish. So
that makes Elvis Presley Jewish.
Great, that's wonderful, and therefore their usage of Elvis Presley as a Shabbos goy was a mistake. But my point is that.
Okay, I'm sorry, Rabbi Fox. I'm sorry. Bert knows who I am and what I do, and I probably shouldn't bring this up, but I do in my own synagogue, and Rabbi Sachs, who is strictly rabbinic, doesn't accept anything I say.
Okay, I think they're great questions, but first let's assume for the purposes of the case, or for this analysis, that we know the status of the people in our community. We know who's Jewish. We know who's not.
Okay, what is the ruling about circumcision for an adult? Does this apply to an adult?
Of course, an adult male who's not circumcised is fully Jewish for every purpose.
So why is it about a baby only?
But that's just the case. The case that we're learning, what's happening here, this is the way halakha works, right? We have case law. The case is the baby needs a circumcision. We don't have the hot water, and we're permitting, or Rabbah permitted, asking the non-Jew to carry the water from point A to point B. So Rabbah permitted, in this reading of the case, a rabbinic violation of Shabbos for the sake of the milah to happen at its right time.
Yeah, I agree with you. I understand completely what you're saying, and I think your analysis is right on target, and everything you said is very perceptive, and I'm honored by your knowledge.
Okay, great. But now we're going to make a comp. Now, so that was the simple version of reading this text. Now, here, let's have fun. Imagine for a moment, if we're all looking at the same document. Now, what I'm going to do is make it more, make it like this. You see now there's a line through line 5. Do you see that? Did that happen for you? If you're, yeah, I just crossed out line 5. Do you
Yes.
right? Now I want to reread the text because we have this is what's called a manuscript problem. Almost all, though not all printed editions, have line 5 in it. By having line 5, it makes it clear that Rabbah was only permitted the non-Jew to carry the water because it was a rabbinic violation of Shabbos. Now let's for a moment remove line 5. That's why I put the strike through line 5. Okay, and now I want to re-understand the whole story. Because line 5 forces you to reinterpret line 4. Line 5 forces us to read the sugiyah as telling me that I can ask a non-Jew to violate Shabbat for me if the thing that I'm asking them to do is only a rabbinic violation of Shabbat. But if I remove line 5, I end up with a different interpretation of the context or framework in which I can actually ask a non-Jew to violate Shabbat. What do I mean by that? If you imagine the text ending with line 4 and line 5 is totally absent, then what happens is, let's just read line 4. V'lo shani lach ben shvut de'it be ma'aseh l'shvut de'leit be ma'aseh. Don't you distinguish between active and passive? An active shvut, rabbinic violation, is sprinkling. And that never can push off Shabbat. A passive violation is speaking, saying to the non-Jew, please bring the water from point A to point B, is passive relative to sprinkling. And if we read it that way, and we don't add in the line about heating up the water, one certainly could make the argument that even if Rabbah would have asked the non-Jew to go and heat up the water, which is a Torah prohibition of Shabbat, it would still be permissible because speech is passive relative to sprinkling. So now there's no difference between air conditioning and heating or your oven and the elevator because it's always permissible as long as there's a need. But the need here is the fulfillment of the mitzvah of Milah in its right time. But as long as there's a need, even if the thing I'm asking is a Torah prohibition, it's totally fine if I can remove line 5 from the mix. And we end up in a world in which different medieval commentators had different texts. So we have a fascinating phenomenon of a textual discrepancy that develops in different lands that actually leads to fundamentally different understandings of the halakha. Because if you have line 5, one is only ever permitted to ask a non-Jew to violate Shabbos at a rabbinic level. If you don't have line 5, then one can even ask a non-Jew to violate Shabbat on a Torah level, heating up the oven or turning on the oven. Okay? Everybody see what's going on? It's a major problem because the text itself is unstable. We don't know what the words are. Forget about trying to interpret the words, trying to apply the case. The words themselves are different in different texts. So now we have to figure out what to do with that. Okay? Everybody with it? Everybody see the difference between what happens if you have line 5 and you don't have line 5? Right? We end up with two very, very different bottom line issues, bottom line conclusions. But what is permissible to ask a non-Jew? Can I have them turn on the oven, or can I only have them turn on the air conditioning? The oven is a Torah prohibition. Air conditioning is a rabbinic prohibition. Okay? What's the official end time, Bert? I forgot to ask that. 12 or 12:30? 12:15?
I think it's 12.
12?
Mhm.
Bert, you're still muted.
But sometimes we go over, which is okay.
Okay, 12, but with a little bit of...
Right.
Great, got it. So let's do one more Gemara text, and we'll do the Rishonim next time we meet. Actually, if you look at page 4, we're not going to look at this inside, but for those of you who are so inclined, you can see that the Hegot Tabach on the side of the page of the printed Talmud actually points out that the girsas are different. And this text that's on the second half of page number 4 here is a volume called the Diktukei Sofrim. Diktukei Sofrim was one of the earlier attempts to compare the printed manuscript of the Talmud with what is known as the Munich manuscript. And he gives you all the different manuscript versions, some of which have that line 5, some of which don't have that line 5. We're not going to go through it inside. I just want you to see it so that I can show you that I'm not just making something up about manuscripts. This is a classic problem that exists throughout different manuscript traditions, manuscript families is usually where people talk about it. And so we have this problem where the text itself, the words in the Talmud, are different in different versions. Okay, it's an interesting phenomenon. Take a look at page number 5. Source number 2. So here we have another case in which the Talmud is going to permit us to lean on a non-Jew for the sake of fulfilling a mitzvah. What I mean by that is, in the case of the circumcision, Rabbi asked a non-Jew to violate Shabbos for the sake of fulfilling the mitzvah of Mila in its correct time. Okay? Now we're going to have another kind of mitzvah in which another rabbi is going to permit the violation of Shabbat by a non-Jew. Says the Gemara in Gittin, page 8b, Chet Amud Bet. The Hakone Sadeh beSuria, and if you purchase a field in Syria, Kekone beParvare Yerushalayim, it's like purchasing a field in the outskirts of Jerusalem. So this is not a contemporary geopolitical claim about the borders of Medinat Israel. This text does seem to be, at least assuming that there is a mitzvah to acquire land in Israel, and it extends that mitzvah to Syria. Let's not try to go from here into 2025. Let's accept for a moment the boundaries that they're talking about and not get pull too far afield. But it does seem to be that the Gemara assumes that there's a mitzvah here called Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, as we'll see that there's a mitzvah to acquire land in Israel. Ask the Gemara, why do I care that Syria has the status of as though it's like the outskirts of Jerusalem? Amar Rav Sheshet, says Rav Sheshet, Lomar, to teach me, Shekotvin alav ono afilu b'Shabbat. You can write the writ of sale even on Shabbos. So if you have a chance to buy land in Israel, according to Rav Sheshet, you can actually write the document. The ono is actually the name and the dates and the place. It's like the standard part of a contract. Says Rav Sheshet, you can write on Shabbos, a Torah prohibition. B'Shabbat, Salka Daitach, says the Gemara, next little section in Hebrew. Rav Sheshet, you're telling me you can write on Shabbos just for the sake of buying land in Israel? No, that's too far. That's going too far. Kida Amar Rava limits this a little bit. Omer Lagoy ve'oseh. Then you can have the non-Jew sign on our behalf. Hachanami Omer Lagoy ve'oseh. Bi'af al gav de Amira Lagoy shavut. And even though asking a non-Jew to violate Shabbos is itself a rabbinic prohibition, Yishum Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, for the sake of the mitzvah of settling the land of Israel, lo gazur rabbanan. It's okay. The rabbis were not goes. The rabbis didn't decree on for the limitation or the prohibition of Amira. So you can tell a non-Jew to sign the documents even on Shabbat. Says Rava, you yourself can't sign, but the non-Jew can sign. Okay, so here we have two examples of mitzvot: Mila, circumcision, and acquiring land in Israel, where the rabbis are permitting Amira, speech acts, some type of a passive violation of Shabbat, for the sake of the fulfillment of a mitzvah. Okay? Yeah, Bert? You're still muted, Bert.
There we go. Isn't writing itself an issa d'oraisa? So what aspect makes this a d'rabbanan?
So the simple answer to that question is, first of all, yes, writing is in Isur Deoraita, and maybe this Gemara doesn't have line 5. So what you're really saying is, if you think that you're only ever allowed to violate on a rabbinic level, how could this Gemara be permitting writing?
Right.
So two answers. First of all, maybe the Gemara actually thinks it's okay to violate a Doraita and doesn't have line 5.
It's okay to violate a d'oraisa by asking a non-Jew to do it.
The non-Jew to violate it.
Yeah, asking a non-Jew to violate the d'oraisa.
The non-Jew could violate even a Doraita for the sake of fulfilling a mitzvah. That's what this text says. There will be one position that maybe we'll get to, maybe we won't, that writing in non-Hebrew or in non-Greek is not a Torah prohibition, which is fascinating. Chazal had this sort of love affair with Greek. Greek is like real writing. You can write a Megillah in Greek. According to some, you can even write a Sefer Torah in Greek. So there is a position, I believe it's the Or Zarua, who claims that writing in a language other than Hebrew or Greek is only a derabanan, because writing means Hebrew or Greek, which says something fascinating about writing and something even more fascinating about Chazal's love affair with Greek. That's what you'll have to.
So according to this, you could write in English?
Yeah. According to writing in English is only in Isur D'Rabbanan. Yeah. Writing in English is not in Isur D'Rabbanan. We don't paskin that way. Don't go quote me as saying you could write on Shabbos in English.
I'm not going to quote you at all.
The Or Zarua says writing in non-Hebrew or in non-Greek is only in Isur D'Rabbanan because of this Gemara. Very strange. That's what he says. Because he's so bothered by the problem. Now we have two texts, both of which permit violating halakha for the sake of fulfillment of mitzvah. The two mitzvot that we have at hand are Mila, circumcision, and Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, acquiring land in Israel. What's different about those two mitzvot than perhaps some other mitzvot? What makes those mitzvot special or unique?
They're similar because they both pertain to Am Yisrael. The Milah is the way that a Jewish male is inducted into Klal Am Yisrael, and the settling of the Eretz Yisrael is part of our ultimate fulfillment of Yishuv Haaretz.
Mm-hmm. Good. So there's a category of mitzvot that I sometimes refer to as super mitzvot. Where Chazal seem to think that certain mitzvot, and sometimes it's obvious why, and sometimes it's less obvious, and sometimes it's built into the system, sometimes it's not. So, for example, when it comes to circumcision, the Torah says, "Uvayom hashmini yimal besor orlato." On the 8th day, you should give the boy a circumcision, and we know that built into that is that even on Shabbat, because doing a milah itself is chilul Shabbat. You can't cut flesh on Shabbat. You can't cut human flesh on Shabbos. Mila is an Isser Doraita on Shabbos. It's only permitted on Shabbat because the Torah tells us you have to do it on Shabbat. And if a person It's really on the father, but in theory, its violation, pushing it off by a day, is a serious violation. So Mila is a special kind of mitzvah, and certainly, at least for the Ramban, let's say, Yishuv Eretz Yisrael is also a kind of a super mitzvah. Another mitzvah that might be in this category is pru urvu. The mitzvah to have children is often treated that way. So you have this interesting idea. Yeah, there are a lot of ways, Lance, in which Hebrew has a different status than all other languages. It's unusual to imagine that Greek should also have a different status than other languages. That's what I was saying is interesting. This is the more interesting part of that.
Well, I think the Seder is with us mainly because the rabbinic zealots at the time wanted to compete against the Greeks who were taking away Jews from Judaism, right?
Right, but that you might think, therefore, that Greek would be a bad language. All the polemics against early Greek and early Christian stuff might lead you to think, therefore, that Greek language is bad. But they went in the opposite direction. They actually embraced Greek as a holy language, or a semi-holy language. You could write a Megillah in Greek.
Okay, well, there are those who think that Mordechai's failure to bow to Haman in the Megillah is actually a Greek concept, and that the Megillah was actually written by Greeks, and that they're using Jews as a front, just like Shakespeare used Shylock as a front for the Puritans.
That's an interesting theory, but my point is that you could even write, like Rav Shimon Gamliel says, you could write a Sefer Torah in Greek, right? It's a deep, there's this notion, the Midrash has this idea of Yafta Elokim Yefet, that Yishkon Shem Ba'ol, that there's something about the Torah of Greece, Greek philosophy, whatever you'll call it, that some parts of Chazal were really drawn to the power of Greek philosophy and of Greek language. And so that the definition of writing was dafka in Greek letters.
But didn't the Greeks say man is the measure of all things when Rabbi Shlomo Riskin says God is the measure of all things?
Well, that's not a good comparison. Greeks and Shlomo. I love Rabbi Riskin. He should be well. But it's more like the Greeks and Shmuel Gamliel, right? We're talking about Tanaim who said these things, not like 21st century rabbis. This is an old Jewish kind of almost love affair with Greek philosophy and Greek culture. And there's also, it's a love-hate. Right? Hanukkah is the opposite, right? We push back against the Greeks. Moshe, did you want to share something?
Yes, we have the Targum Shivim. We have the Septuagint.
Yeah, the Septuagint was understood to be like all miraculous, right? They, according to Chazal, at least, they were separated into 70 different rooms, and they changed things, and the things they changed were all the same.
Exactly, but it was in Greek.
And it's in Greek, yeah, that's what I'm saying. The Greek there is...
It's holy.
Greek language has a special status in halakha, which is fascinating, such that it defines the Torah parameters of ktiva on Shabbat, of writing, which is really, it's shocking when you think about it, that somehow Greek should be different, that Greek should be like Hebrew. It's one thing to say you can pray in Hebrew even if you don't understand it. You can pray in Greek if you don't understand it. I don't know. I have never seen it, but there was I don't know if people saw this some years ago. Rabbi Linzer and Rabbi Devora had a Megillah written in English for their son. Can't read Hebrew, doesn't read Hebrew. So the Megillah is different because you can write it in any language. But even a Sefer Torah that written in Greek, in theory, would be permissible. I never saw one. I don't even think Greek Jews have Greek Sefer Torah or Sefer Megillah. But it would be quite interesting to see how far people are willing to take this kind of notion.
Would it be just the letters would be Greek, but the words would be Hebrew words? Or would it be the words would actually be Greek words, translations?
I think it's translation. It seems like translation, which is why the Septuagint is interesting, because you have a sort of an official translation. It is hard to translate. In the Megillah, it's hard to. There are certain words that in the Megillah that are really hard to translate. What are achshtar parnim? Nobody really knows some of those words are.
And isn't there a difference between ancient Greek, like which was during these times that we're learning about, versus modern Greek?
Yeah, for sure. You'd have to do it in a language. I don't know. Since no one, it's not like a practical usually question. I don't know. Would it be modern Greek, contemporary Greek, ancient Greek? I don't know, but it's interesting to imagine what that would look like. So here's the big question when it comes to these two texts. These two texts give us a paradigm that for the sake of fulfillment of mitzvah, we have two questions. For the sake of fulfillment of mitzvah, a Jew can ask a non-Jew to violate Shabbat. Two questions. Number one, is it two very special mitzvot, like Milah and Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, circumcision and settling the land of Israel, which maybe those are super mitzvot? Or to ask it differently, are those two mitzvot exceptions, or are they the rule? Is it just they happen to choose circumcision and Yishuv Eretz Yisrael because those are like the cases that it came up in? Or did the rabbis choose those because they're like super mitzvot? And of course, for their sake, we'll violate Shabbos. That's question number one. Question number two is, in each individual instance, is the thing that we're asking the non-Jew to do a Torah prohibition or a rabbinic prohibition? Are we asking the non-Jew to heat up the water? Or are we asking the non-Jew to carry the water inside the chatzir? Are we asking the non-Jew to write in Hebrew? Or are we asking the non-Jew to write in English? So we have all these two questions are going to be what drives the subsequent kind of halachic narrative. And some of that will be, do you have line 5 in that original text? Meaning, if you have line 5, then a lot of things have to flow from there. We're going to see a three-way machloket rishonim. We're not going to do it now; it'll take us too far afield. We'll see a three-way machloket rishonim. Some being super lenient and some being super stringent, and then how that lands in the Shulchan Aruch will be lots of fun because you'll have three different options from the medieval positions, from amongst the medieval Rishonim, medieval rabbis, and then how those three options show up in the Shulchan Aruch is really where, at some level, halacha happens. What I mean by that is once you can sort of make sense of the Gemara and categorize the various Rishonim, the medieval rabbis, and then you take a look at the Shulchan Aruch as a kind of a pinch point in the history of halacha, then you'll have to figure out, well, what do I do now when I have a need of some particular nature? What if my need is greater? What if my need is less than? So what's the difference between walking up one flight of stairs or walking up 37 flight of stairs? What's the difference between walking up a flight of stairs and I'm in a wheelchair, or walking up a flight of stairs with a baby carriage, or walking up a flight of stairs and I'm in good health? Right? There's different levels of human need that will be different person by person. And so part of what makes these Amira, these asking non-Jew questions interesting is that you have to calibrate the need on an individual basis. So a young person, an older person, a broken leg, a non-broken leg, with the presence of a baby or not a baby, carrying food, all those things will be very, very different on a case-by-case basis. What if there is a non-Jew available? What if there's a non-Jew whose job it is to press the button? All sorts of the sort of individual case-by-case become quite fascinating once you can figure out how to plug in the rules one at a time. Okay.
And then you need rabbis.
That's why you need rabbis. Thank you very much. I hope so. Hopefully, but that's why you need good rabbis to actually understand that one person's need might actually be different from another.
Right, to understand the halacha and the human aspect too.
Correct. Both of them will be necessary. Okay, we're going to stop here. I'll stop the share. We'll stop here, and then what we'll do next time, and Bert, as soon as I know if I have a ticket, I'll let you know. Either a week from today or 2 weeks from today, I'll be back for sure. We'll figure out what makes the most sense. Okay?
Thank you, and Yasher Koach.
Thank you, everybody.